Caribe Radio nos proponemos ser la emisora online calificada para ser la mejor opción en comunicación para usted. Nos preparamos en noticias, deportes, cultura, música y de entretenimiento general para que usted esté conectado todo el tiempo con nosotros. Caribe Radio ofrece el mejor servicio de comunicación digital para que las empresas se hagan visibles a diferentes públicos. Desde lo público trabajamos para el servicio y por el servicio social. Caribe Radio Online nos entrenamos día a día para brindar la mejor opción en producción de medios digitales. Caribe Radio, la radio del futuro.
Los conceptos, productos y servicios del siguiente espacio son responsabilidad del director del programa y no representan el pensamiento de esta emisora.
Good afternoon. This is Discussions with Authors, part of Books Over Drinks, an online community meant to foster the passion for books by providing a platform for both authors and readers to exchange ideas and discuss their work. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Wade Davis, an anthropologist and a professor of anthropology at the University of British Columbia. Wade is a prolific writer, a photographer, filmmaker, whose work has taken him from the Amazon to Tibet, Africa to Australia, Polynesia to the Arctic. An explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society, he was named one of the explorers for the millennium. David holds a degree in anthropology and biology and received his PhD in ethnobotany, all from Harvard University. He spent over 3 years in the Amazon and Andes as a plant explorer, living among 15 indigenous groups in 8 Latin American nations. Himself, an honorary Colombian citizen, a country that he knows well enough to have written detailed accounts of his travels and the people and land that hosted him along the way. Author of 23 books, today he's joining us to discuss his latest one, Magdalena, River of Dreams, a wonderful book about the country with a complex past, widely misunderstood by those who have only come to hear the name through the protagonists of its darkest moments. A book that is as much about Colombia's political and cultural history as it is about the river from which it takes its name. A land of biological and ecological diversity, Colombia is a land covered by pristine forests spared by the hand of progress, home to snow-covered volcanoes, 1,900 different birds of species, half of the total world species, by the way, and more natural resources and cultural diversity than almost any other nation in the world. A country fueled by its land and rivers, but also by more than 50 million people who seek comfort in the wishful future by letting go of the misfortunes of the past. The Magdalena River, or as its author calls it, the Mississippi of Colombia, is the country's environmental and economic heart. A river that flows northward across the country, acting as its engine of progress, responsible for most of the country's GDP, agricultural production, and hydroelectric energy, all of which has taken a toll on the river, tainting its waters with sediments and pollution. This is a book that transports readers to this beautiful country and along 1,000 miles from south to north of the Magdalena River, painting a more accurate depiction of the country's past, present, and future. All in all, David's pragmatic take on the country is filled with the poetic beauty and magical realism characteristic of these countries, and most important, literally give to the world. Something that he modestly explains as simply being a literal depiction of a magical place. This book is a book that we're certain you'll enjoy from cover to cover, and hope that sparks interest in this beautiful country and the work of this amazing author and explorer. Wade, thank you so much for joining us. We're happy to have you here with us.
Well, thank you very much, Jairo. It's wonderful to be with you, and thanks for that very warm and generous introduction.
Absolutely. We love the book, by the way. This was an amazing text. Before diving into Magdalena, I wanted us to discuss briefly One River, a book you published, I believe, more than 2 decades ago, with an account of your travels through the region. A book I believe you signed away the rights to in Spanish, to its Spanish edition, so that it would be accessible to Colombian readers, ultimately taking a sort of life on its own and sparking interest of wishful younger generations unable to explore the country the same way you did. So can you tell us a little about the story
Yeah,
of One
I think
River?
it's a fun place to start, Jairo, because in a way the books are very intimately related. I wrote One River, or El Rio, as was published in Spanish back in the 1990s, and it's really sort of a biography of the legendary botanical explorer, my professor at university, Richard Evans Schultes, the man who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery first of the magic mushroom, so-called, in Mexico in 1938. And then in 1941, he slipped away into the Northwest Amazon of Colombia, a forest the size of France. And he remained there for really 12 uninterrupted years, traveling down unknown rivers, living amongst unknown peoples, all the time enchanted by the wonder of the neotropical rainforests. And as a young student, I fell, like many did, into his orbit. And when I was sort of 20, and sort of seeking, you don't go out, like Bob Dylan said, you don't go out on the road to find yourself. That makes no sense. You go out on the road to create yourself. And I certainly wanted to do that. And I was in a cafe in Harvard Square, and there was a National Geographic map of the world right beside me. And I was with my best friend and roommate. And David looked at the map and he looked to me, and we were both 20 years old, and he suddenly pointed to the high Arctic of Canada. Well, I had to go somewhere, and my arm lifted and it pointed to the Northwest Amazon of Colombia, obviously inspired by Schultes in some sense. And having decided to go there, I had to go see him, and I knocked on his door very shyly. And I got as far as saying, "Sir, I'm from British Columbia. I've saved up money in a logging camp, and I want to go to the Amazon as you did and collect plants." At the time, I knew nothing about botany, nothing about the Amazon. And he heard that magic word, Colombia, and he thought I was talking about his beloved Colombia. And then the adjective British, of course, attracted him, because he was such an Anglophile that one of his colleagues said the only way for Schultes to quote unquote go native would be to go to London. So instead of asking me, who I was, or who my father was, or where my money came from, or what classes I had taken, this man for whom mountains would be named in South America, a man who was a legend of the 20th century, simply peered across a mound of plant specimens through his antiquated bifocals and said very simply, "Well, son, when do you want to go?" And 2 weeks later, I landed in Bogota at El Dorado Airport with no plans whatsoever, a small backpack of clothes, and 2 books, Lawrence's Taxonomy of Plants and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And at the time, I believed that bliss was a subjective state you could achieve just by opening yourself unabashedly to the world. So both literally and metaphorically, I drank from every stream, even from tire tracks in the road. And naturally, I was constantly sick, but these sort of dysentery and malaria fevers that would rise through the night and then break with the dawn. But even that seemed part of the process. Once on a day's notice, I accepted a commission to guide an eccentric Englishman from Barranquelitos on the road from Medellin to Turbo across to Panama City through the notorious Darien Gap in the middle of the rainy season when it was said to be impassable. And we had to cross all the swamps and wetlands of the Ciénaga del Rio Atrato before we even got to the Atrato River, and then cross that and go up the isthmus. And I remember when we got lost for 2 weeks with 3 native people with no shelter and no food. And when I finally got to safety in Panama, I was 20 years old. I stumbled off a small plane, drenched in vomit from my fellow passengers because we had gotten in this terrible storm. And I had $3 to my name and nowhere to go, but I had never felt more alive. And along the way, of course, I fell in with Schultes' great protege, Tim Plowman, who was 30 years old, which seemed terribly old to me at the time. And he had the dream academic grant of the 1970s, a huge amount of money from the US Department of Agriculture and a brand new fire engine red Dodge 4x4 pickup truck, and the mission to study the divine leaf of immortality, coca, the notorious source of cocaine. So from a very early age, I became a student of botany and a student in particular of coca and its traditional use. And so the book One River really tells those two stories, and it came out in English in the 1996, but the Spanish edition, which really isn't my book, came out in 2002. And I say it's not my book because it was so elegantly translated by a wonderful Colombian poet, the late Nicholas Sescuan. And in Spanish, it comes out about 120 pages longer. And Nicholas was this extraordinary gift, such a beautiful man who set his own work aside to bring One River into being in one of the most elegant translations ever executed, I would say, of a work of literary nonfiction. And I had initially just given the rights to the Banco de la República just to get it out in Spanish for my Colombian friends. And then I kind of forgot about it as my career took me all around the world. And it was only when I went back to make a film in Colombia, I think in 2008, that I realized the book had sort of taken on a life of its own. And the key aspect of the book, I suppose, is that coming out in 2002, that was a year when Colombia's very ability to survive as a nation state was being called into question. And you might wonder why a 650-page book of botany and ethnography that said nothing about the war, the violence, and only described the beauty of the Colombian people would hit such a nerve. But I think it did, and became this massive hit. And not just read by botanists and anthropologists, as you would expect, but by poets and politicians. And I even got a call out of the blue from Marta Ochoa, whose brother Fabio was in jail in Georgia, locked away for life, one part of the Medellin cartel. His sister said, he just loves the book so much, could you go visit him? And I think for the key thing about that book is that for a whole generation, your generation, Jairo, and slightly older, the book became kind of a map of dreams for kids that weren't able to travel in their own country. And so because it, of course, told the story of the journeys that I was able to make in the 1970s, early 70s, where I could go anywhere my feet would carry me and sleep where my hat fell. And one of the link to Magdalena is that a wonderful man who was the head of Grupo Argos at the time, Jose Alberto Velez, read the book, and he decided, with working with two prominent journalists in Medellin, Ana Cano and Hector Rincon, they put together a series of books that Argos funded called Savia Botanica, and each book was a beautiful illustrated book of each of the 5 major regions of Colombia, the Caribbean coastal plain, the Andean Cordilleras in the central Andean part of the country, of course, the great west forests of the Pacific, the Chocó, the great eastern plains, the Llanos, and then finally the Amazon itself. And these books were not to be sold, but gifted to every library in the country to send a message to a new generation of kids that their country wasn't a country of violence and war, but it was the land of the greatest biodiversity on earth, a place, as I always say, not of violence, but of colores y cariño, colors and love. And they asked me to help promote one of those books. And as we were having lunch one day, I sort of almost casually said, well, now we've done the landscape, why don't we do the rivers? And without hesitation, they agreed on a project to chronicle the Rio Magdalena, which is, as you noted in your introduction, is the Mississippi of Colombia. The Cuenca of the Magdalena is home to 80% of Colombians. It generates 80% of the national wealth. It runs from south to north. And like the Mississippi, it's both a corridor of commerce, but also a fountain of culture, the source of Colombian poetry, literature, music, and prayer. And what began initially as a sort of a casual assignment to write a 7,000-word piece that would introduce this illustrated book, the river and the story just took on a life of its own. And it's interesting, the title, the subtitle in the Spanish edition, which has just come out in Colombia, is Historias de Colombia, and it really is that. You know, in a way the whole book was it's kind of like sociology is serendipity. You know, I traveled for a time with a wonderful Colombian journalist, a good friend of mine now, I call him Juancito Betancourt, and he was a journalist in the Medio Magdalena throughout the worst of the violence, and he was enchanted by the river himself. He had done his own book on the river, a beautiful book, and Juan used to talk about just turning up in a village and waiting until you met someone who had something to say that was interesting. And it always, when he told me that, it reminded me of what Hemingway said, that the most essential, you know, credential for a story is to be saying something that the world needs to hear that it doesn't know. And in a way, that's what the book became. And so in many ways, I sometimes felt like, although I did do all the writing myself, but I felt like a stenographer, just sort of recording these wonderful poetic statements and feelings from Colombian people I met. So in many ways, I feel that the book, particularly the Spanish edition, is not my book, but our book. And it's kind of a, you know, it's kind of a, as Hector Abad, Colombia's great writer, said, it's kind of a love letter to the country, you know, and its attempt to, driven in part to tell us what at least my truth is about Colombia. And I think it's important to share with people who don't know the modern history of Colombia that, yes, there was 50 years of violence that resulted in 260,000 dead, 100,000 missing, 7 million internally displaced, 5 million Colombians who by either volition or coercion or circumstances were decided to leave their country. But in a nation of 50 million, there were never more than 300,000 combatants on all three sides of the conflict, the Paracos, the various leftist groups, FARC, ELN, and others, and the army itself. And so the vast majority of Colombian people were innocent victims of a war that never would have lasted a day without the sordid profits of prohibition. You know, in the last year of the conflict, before the signing of the historic Acuerdo negotiated in Havana but signed in Cartagena, the FARC were down to 6,000 cadre, the most prominent of the leftist groups, mostly teenagers in search of 3 meals a day. And yet that year they made $600 million in extortion and drug trafficking. Well, if you give me the Beverly Hills Boy Scouts and $600 million, I can wreak havoc in California. And the extraordinary thing about Colombia is that despite the drug money, which has been the only fuel of the fire of war, the country has managed to maintain its democracy, green its cities, create millions of acres of national parks, seek restitution with indigenous people in a way that has not been matched by any nation state, and pave the way for an economic and cultural renaissance as literally 2 generations of kids your age, Jairo, are coming back from all places in the world. You're in Miami, you've got colleagues on this call all around the world. You're all going back and you're coming back home with skill sets in every conceivable vocation and endeavor, from the arts to technology to science to medicine. So Colombia is on the edge of an incredible period in its history. And you know, the other thing we should remember is that Colombians never use cocaine. You know, my friend Sandra Uribe, una paisa, más paisa que los paisas, as a 15-year-old girl, when she couldn't in Medellin distinguish the sound of thunder from the sound of bombs, her family decided she should go live with a grandmother in Miami. She was immediately made fun of for being from the land of Pablo Escobar by American teenagers whose main social activity was a pursuit of drugs, with Colombian cocaine being the drug of choice. Sandra in Medellin had never used or seen cocaine, right? And so, you know, think about this, Jairo. How would the world feel, or how would Americans feel, if Canada, for example, had patterns of drug consumption in bars and boardrooms across our country laws that facilitated a black market trade, but sanctions that did nothing whatsoever to limit that trade, such that 85 million Americans were forced to leave their homes. Well, that's what happened in Colombia. So in part, Magdalena is an antidote to all that. It's a book that, you know, people are always, you know, you cited magical realism as Colombia's great gift through Gabo or Gabriel Garcia Marquez to Latin American literature. But we always have to remember that Gabo was a journalist and a periodista all of his life. He just wrote of what he saw. And he just happened to live in a land where heaven and earth converge on a regular basis to reveal glimpses of the divine. You know, only in Colombia can you walk ashore on a desert coast. You make your way through wetlands that shine like mirrors to the heavens, ascend through tropical forests to reach within days rich, verdant, temperate landscapes as bucolic as anything you'd find in the old world. You know, there is no nation on earth that has such concentration of biodiversity, of topographical diversity. There is no place in Colombia more than a day removed from every known ecological niche on the face of the planet. This is the crossroads of the world. I mean, this is why it's so botanically rich. Just think about where it's situated on the corner of South America. In fact, when part of the reason the drug trade stopped in Colombia is that Colombians are so bloody entrepreneurial, and the países más que todo, they're not going to let that go through their fingers. And, you know, some people call Colombia la tienda a la esquina. I mean, you know, but biologically, you've got the Caribbean influences, you've got the Central American influences, you've got the Amazonian influences, you got the Andean influences, all coming together in this sort of epic evolutionary struggle of plant, animal, insect, a bird, you know, and that accounts for the wonder of Colombia. And another point to make on that is that Colombia is the only nation state that was forged in its independence in a vision of its natural beauty. You know, the greatest influence on Simón Bolívar, who incidentally, whereas Washington liberated a sliver of the Atlantic seaboard, the liberator of Colombia, Simón Bolívar, liberated an entire continent, traveling 75,000 miles on horseback to do so. But his maps in his saddlebags were the maps of Alexander von Humboldt. And he spent a lot of time with Humboldt in Paris. And when Humboldt spoke of notions of, you know, a universe of nature, they were somewhat metaphorical for Humboldt, but young Simón Bolívar took them literally. He hated the Spaniards because the Spaniards he saw as being, they had an economic model of pure extraction. They treated local people terribly. If you were born in the Americas, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't have a printing press, you couldn't grow grapes, you couldn't do any number of things. The Spanish model, colonial model, amazing that it endured so long because you couldn't design a system better designed to promote revolution. So that for Simón, it was the rape of the Americas that symbolized the Spaniards, and therefore the land itself, the forest, became the symbol of freedom for him. And that's kind of an amazing thing in Colombia's history, and it's encoded in the Constitution. And then we go ahead, you know, several 200 years, because this is the 200th anniversary of the independence of Gran Colombia. And one of the things about the war, the only peace dividend, if you will, is that 50 years of violence kept much of Colombia insulated from the ravages of industrial development. So a country like Ecuador that made decisions about the Oriente in the 1970s, that opened it up for colonization, deforestation, oil exploration, and extraction, to the point where, you know, cities like Lago Agrio, which when I was there in 1974 was a couple of huts, now is this massive sort of urban chaotic center in the middle of the forest, but there is no more forest. And whereas Colombia, for example, the Amazon of Colombia, the size of France, now imperiled but nevertheless remains roadless. And so Colombia has this amazing opportunity to re-envision its future, informed by 50 years of scientific investigation as to the importance of biological and cultural diversity that simply didn't exist when Ecuador made that fateful decision way back in the 1970s. And Colombians just, it's often said in Colombia that, God gave so much to the Colombians, he's always going to get something on the back end, right? And the amazing thing about Colombia, amongst many things, is you still have, at least 87, 90 indigenous groups, all of whom have something to say that the world needs to hear. And, the fact that in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the highest coastal mountain range on earth that soars out of the Caribbean coastal plain, near Santa Marta, you still have the sun priests, descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization, sacerdotes, who each day are praying for our collective well-being with this extraordinary wisdom, 2 hours by plane from Miami Beach. And I was with one of my old friends in Arahuaco, Mamo Camilo, and he said something really incredible to me. He said, "La paz no vale nada si es solamente una manera en que los varios lados del conflicto pueden unificarse para mantener una guerra contra la naturaleza. Tenemos que tener paz con todo el mundo." And what he was saying, of course, for those who may not understand Spanish, is peace won't matter if it's just an excuse for the various sides of the conflict to come together to maintain a war against nature. We have to create peace with the natural world. And there is a strong sense of that. I mean, right after he told me that, he asked me if I could go to Namasimoke to help them welcome President Juan Manuel Santos, who was about to pay his first visit to the main center of the Arahuaco people. And I promised that I would try, knowing full well the only way I could do it logistically was to hop a ride on the presidential plane. And so I've phoned a Colombian friend who phoned the Palacio Nariño, and word came back very generously from President Santos, said he'd be happy to have Profi Davis along for the ride. So I flew from Barranquilla, your hometown, to Bogota, and a soldier took me over to the presidential plane. As we flew back up to Valledupar to pick up the helicopters, all President Santos's aides were sort of peppering him with datos, and I put up my hand in the plane and very quietly said, Presidente tiene que entender que para los mamos los datos no valen nada. Lo que es importante es lo que está en su corazón, what's in your heart. And he then made that, and I told him what Mamo Camilo had told me. And the president, who I think, to his amazing credit, made that the theme of the speech that he tweeted out to the whole broadcast and tweeted to the nation and the world. And that says something when a voice of a traditional people like that. I mean, Colombia is no perfect place any more than Canada is in terms of the treatment of indigenous people, but no country can match what Colombia did in 1985. 1985, when President Virgilio Barco, at the height of the war, with Colombia on its knees in a way, he said to my friend Martin von Hildebrand, a wonderful, he's like a brother. I dedicate the book to him, in fact, Magdalena. Martin, he said, do something for the Indians. And in the Amazon, and in 5 incredible years as the head of Asuntos Indígenas, Martin did more than something. He secured legal land tenure to an area of land collectively the size of the United Kingdom for the 57 ethnicities of the Northwest Amazon of Colombia. And behind the veil of isolation created by the conflict in Colombia, a whole new dream of culture was born. And no nation state can claim such an achievement. It's sort of, for example, I mean, people are always saying, what about the peace agreement? What happened to it? Well, it's complicated. The peace agreement had hundreds of clauses with a price tag of $45 billion at a time when oil prices dropped, Colombia's main source of foreign revenue, and Colombia absorbed the largest humanitarian crisis in the history of the Americas. And when 2 million Venezuelans fled that dystopic regime, They weren't met at the border of Colombia as the victims of American foreign policy and the drug cartels in Central America were treated at the American-Mexican border, turned back, ignored, children taken away from their families and caged. No,
they were well received.
They were well received. They were housed and fed and given medical care and food and put in shelter, and the kids were put in school. And even the conservative president, Ivan Duque, granted them rights to work in Colombia at a time when the Colombian economy was under tremendous pressure. I can tell you, no nation state in the history of the world has been that magnanimous and generous to the people in need in a neighboring nation. And I don't personally think that Colombia has gotten anything like the credit that it deserves for that gesture. So, I mean, part of what Magdalena, but, it's not, I mean, the whole thing about the book, it's like Hector said, it's a love letter. It's not it deals with the violence. It doesn't pretend the violence didn't happen, but it explains with empathy why and how this all came about, even as it, describes the real Colombia that I've always known, the magical Colombia. I mean, I remember there's a guy in the book I really like, Morita de los Manatees. He's this guy he was just a humble kind of field worker in the cane fields of around Sabana de Torres in the Medio Magdalena. And he just fell in love with manatees, and they became kind of his source of power. He became kind of like the avatar of these incredible creatures of the lower Magdalena. And he with that power, he faced down the FARC and the Paracos and the military and maintained the integrity of his own community as its leader. And he did a lot of work with school kids. And one day we were just walking, we actually were in a boat around a small little wetland. And Morita told me that around that little wetland, the kids had found 75 different species of butterflies. And I said, carajo, hombre, es increíble, porque en Canadá, a lo menos quizás tenemos 200, we're this big country of Canada. Maybe we've got 200 species of butterflies. You're telling me you found 75 around this pond. And he said, yeah. But then he said, pero hermano, la cosa es eso. Tiene que entender que en Colombia una mariposa es solamente un flor que puede volar. Por eso tenemos tanto, So, he said, yeah, but my brother, you have to understand, it's logical, it's logical. It's like in Colombia, of course, a butterfly is just a flower that knows how to fly. That's why we've got so many. And to me, those kind of moments really sort of sum up. And then, the other thing that came so strongly wherever we went, and we didn't set this up, it was amazing. The book was in a way conceived in a moment of great optimism, in the wake of the signing of the agreement. And as everywhere I went on the river, there was people volunteered a central idea. Para limpiar nuestra alma tenemos que limpiar el río. Y si podemos limpiar el río, we can clean our soul. There was this amazing sense of how the river is the fountain of everything. It's like Carlos Vivas, who was the great musical legend of Latin America, but he's also a brilliant scholar of music. He's an ethnomusicologist who just published his own book on cumbiana. He understands cumbia, which is Colombia's great musical gift to the world. But as Carlos told me, he says, cumbia is the mother of all forms of music in Colombia. Merengue, the reinvented salsa, poro, tambora, whatever. But the mother of cumbia, he said, is the river, the Magdalena. And this idea of cleaning the river became something that was just all, for example, we went in the biggest wetland, one of the most dramatic wetlands, of course, the Ciénaga del Río, the Grande de Santa Marta, and we went out to these floating fishing villages like Nueva Venecia, where in typical Colombian fashion, the cats swim and the dogs are afraid of water. And there was a terrible massacre there by the Paracos, the right-wing death squads, militias. In 2003, 39 men were just slaughtered. simply for having hosted ELN group that had moved through. I mean, people were just caught in the vice of war, you know, and this is what people don't understand. If they refused service to one side of the conflict, they invoked its wrath. If they gave any kind of support, even at gunpoint, in terms of supplies, they invited the wrath of the opposition and ultimately the military. And the key thing is the right-wing militias could not be everywhere, and the leftists could strike anywhere. And so the right-wing militias settled on terror as a way of having their presence everywhere. And if you cut somebody up with a chainsaw and toss their body parts into the river, you'll sow fear. And that, I think, accounts for the nasty, bloody, almost inconceivable violence that one hears about. But and this is what happened in Nueva Venecia. They were just innocent victims of retribution. But we asked a fisherman, what could the state do in the process of reconciliation to possibly compensate the community for its agonies? And it was interesting because what the fisherman said, first of all, okay, we need new houses. And then he hesitates, said, no, what's good a house? We need a healthy cienega, fish. And then he hesitated again, no, what's good to make the healthy cienega if the rivers coming into the cienega aren't healthy? No, we need to help. And finally he stopped and he said, carajo, mierda, la cosa que necesitamos el río Magdalena. The mother Magdalena must be cleaned, source to mouth. That's what we need. That's the only thing that will make a difference. That's how we will clean our souls. And to give, you know, to give people a sense of the importance of the river, you know, one of the most extraordinary things about Colombia, of course, is its topography. And so it was impossible, although railroads were built, it was extraordinarily difficult to do so simply because the grades were so precipitous. That's one of the reasons Colombia embraced air travel so early and so completely as a nation, as a people. But for much of Colombia's history, cities like Bogota, then called the Athens of South America, you know, a series of major institutions and universities, botanical gardens, museums, not to mention industrial infrastructure. But everything in the city arrived there from Honda, the head of the navigation on the Magdalena, on the back of a mule. The whole country was woven together by these caminos de arrieros, you know, and everything had to be carried on a mule for much of its history. And those caminos, or those trochas, became like threads that wove together to create the fabric of the nation. Or in a way, they were also umbilical cords that linked the cities of the interior to the Magdalena. This is something that it's very difficult for people who don't know Colombia perhaps to grasp. But all, with the exception of Cali, which is of course on the banks of the Cauca, or Neiva, which is on the banks of the Magdalena and Huila, all these other centers, Pereira, not just Bogota and Medellin, which are both in the cuenca of the Magdalena, the overall drainage of the Magdalena, but Manizales, Bucaramanga, Pereira, all these other cities are distant from the river. And as the river comes down, it flows through, I can't remember, is it 8 or 9 departments or states of Colombia, right? And each state has an urban center. And each urban center is linked to a port town on the Magdalena. And so from the point of view of the country, the Magdalena seems like the frontier, right? And that's why the Medio Magdalena got its reputation as being a kind of a place of outlaws and bandidos. It's not an accident that Escobar created his famous finca, Hacienda Nápoles, you know, right next door to Puerto Triunfo, which is one of Medellin's port cities on the Magdalena. So you had this kind of inversion of the notion of frontier, where the central corridor of the country, the Magdalena, was seen from the point of view of these urban centers as being the frontier. And so it was settled very, very late. And so, for example, as recently as the 1950s, you could send a bushel of coffee from Medellin to London for less money than sending it from Medellin across the country to Bogota.
That's great.
And so each of those port cities takes on its own kind of character. And most of them grew up as fueling station for the vapores, these legendary wood-driven steam riverboats that became sort of characters in the novels of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right? And of course, it was in the river that the Paracos would toss the bodies of the dead. And this became a kind of an iconic image in Colombia, the corpse floating down the Magdalena con gallinazos encima, with vultures on top pecking at the flesh. And part of this was that the Paracos were trying to kill the people twice. They killed them physically, but then in obliterating their identity, they denied them final rights, right? And one of the things the Paracos always said, if anyone takes the bodies out of the river, they'll be there with them. So it was this culture of fear, but people didn't always obey. On the contrary, in the small town of Puerto Bereo, something miraculous happened. There were a series of remolinas or whirlpools where the currents would gather and the corpses would spin. And the fishermen, for a long time, fearful of the Paracos, would pretend not to see what was right in front of their eyes. But eventually their Christian charity did not permit that. And they began to take these body parts out and initially bury them in the sandbars. But eventually they said that's not enough. And they began to take them into the beaches of the town. And women would be there with wheelbarrows to pick them up, to carry these rotting corpses to the cemetery, where they pressured the priest to finally give them, to baptize them. They became known as in English, no names or no nombres, people without names, the NANAs. And they were baptized, but not just baptized, but the people of Puerto Bereo gave them the names of their own lost and missing children. They adopted them into the lineage spiritually. And this was an extraordinary gesture for a Colombian to make. And it's as if the entire community stood up in resistance of evil and said, I'm sorry, no, we don't know who you are, but our river brought us to you, and we will not abandon you. And our children and our children's children will be able to say for the rest of history that when the country was in need, ese pueblo, subió para reclamar los muertos. It's just such a moving story of redemption. And those are the stories that the book Magdalena highlights. Let me, one of the persons who Jairo turned me on to this notion of the importance of the arrieros. I always loved the mule guys because I always traveled with them, right? But I didn't understand the linkage. And my friend Herman Ferro, who is the head of the one museum in Colombia dedicated to the river in Honda, he didn't either. I mean, he tells a wonderful story. His father was one of the engineers who built the modern city of Girardot, where the Rio Bogota reaches the Magdalena. And Herman told me that all of his childhood, on weekends, the family would say, let's go down, bajamos a Tierra Caliente, let's go down the hot country. And he said, no one ever told me we're going down to hot country or Tierra Caliente. We were in fact going to the Cuenca of the Magdalena, the river that gave birth to the nation. It was just like, let's go down to the country club or to, And it was only when he did his PhD on the arrieros as an anthropologist that he saw this connection. And his love of the Magdalena was expressed when I met him and interviewed him. We later became good friends. But this is what he said, and this is just straight out of his mouth, the first day that I met him in his office at the Museum of the Magdalena in Honda, which every Colombian should visit and support. He said, I'll never forget the moment when I first heard that the peace agreement had been signed in Havana. By chance, I was at the very confluence of the Rio Cauca and the Magdalena, of course, the Cauca being the great affluent that also comes out of the Macizo Colombiano. and then joins the Magdalena below as the Correa Central falls away to the Caribbean coastal plain. I was completely overwhelmed by what I can only call geographical emotion, a sense of space, as if the spirits were emerging from the earth. I stripped off my clothes and placed my head in the river. As I stood in the sun, the water dripping down my naked body, I began to weep. Rivers of tears flowed as I realized that my son could grow up in a country at peace. A river that has known every tragedy, that has carried the dead and all the misery of the nation, that has suffered along with all Colombians, a river that I love so much, and there we were by its waters as peace came over the land. I mean, to me, that is such a beautiful passage summing up what this river means to Colombians. You know, peel back the layers of any family, you know, step into the past of any family in Colombia, and you will always find the Rio Magdalena.
Absolutely, absolutely. Such a wonderful collection of stories that you've gathered here. There were a few things that I was going to say, that on the book itself, I think what it does well is that for those that are not aware of the country, it unveils. It doesn't just showcase the country itself, but it just unveils all the natural wonders that exist behind it and that are just overshadowed by many of the things that have just gone mainstream about drugs and the internal conflict that there's been in the country. But on the other side, for the people of Colombia, it becomes also a very hopeful book. It's just a book that brings hope with it, just like you described your experience with writing and the aftermath of the writing of the One River, is that it just paints a different picture, a very refreshing view, gives a very refreshing view of Colombia.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you say that, Jairo, but you know, think about it, son. You know, we talk about, you know, narcos and the unfair caricature of the country, but we forget about the psychological impact on your generation. You know, you've grown up almost as a pariah in the world simply because you were born in Colombia. You know, it's interesting, when I was very generously invited to become an honorary Colombian citizen by President Juan Manuel Santos in a beautiful ceremony in the Palacio Nariño, I was deeply honored. But one of the reasons I wanted to do it is I wanted to be able to look Colombians in the face. You know, there's a very famous story of World War II when Buckingham Palace is bombed by the Nazis. And the British say to the king and queen, well, don't you want to go out into the countryside and escape? And, you know, and the queen mother, well, Queen Elizabeth at the time, I guess was she Queen Mary? I can't remember, you know, the queen's mom said, no, I'm staying right here because finally I can look the East Enders in the face. In other words, the poor people of the east of London had been bombed like the devil. And finally, she felt like she could stand up with them. And I felt that, you know, ever since I got my Colombian passport, I had my Nexus card revoked by the United States. Every time I go into the United States now, I am automatically taken to secondary search and all my bags are packed. I have no criminal record. I'm a member of the Order of Canada. I'm almost 70 years old. I'm a well-known writer. There's only one explanation, is that because of my Colombian passport, and perhaps because there have been some legitimate payments from publishers, royalty payments. You know, after all, Colombia is a country of 50 million people with a dynamic, you know, economy of, you know, but anything over $10,000 they assume is drug money. I don't know what it is, Jairo, but I've felt what Colombians go through, you know. And I think, you know, Carolina Barco, who's a good friend of mine, when she was ambassador to Washington, D.C., I mean, Carolina was the former head of external affairs in Colombia, the equivalent of the Secretary of State in the United States. She was a daughter of a very highly regarded and beloved president, Virgilio Barco. But she told me a story of going to Dulles Airport where she was strip searched simply because she had a Colombian passport. And when she objected and presented her diplomatic credentials, the customs people, dismissed her appeal with an obscenity as a bark from the mouth of a dog. Well, if that happens to the ambassador, what happens to a young kid like you who goes back to Miami? And so I think part of it is that we forget that, yes, there's the emotional trauma of war. One of the horrible things is that every Colombian family has suffered. Scratch the surface, and there's another thing. Max Hastings, the great British historian, talks about being in the Soviet Union after World War II, and you go out to dinner, and there'd be a nice two Russian couples, and someone would say, oh, my uncle was killed in that gulag, and then someone else chirps in like, oh, my sister was killed there too, as if they had just discovered they went to the same high school together. Well, that's a little bit like a dinner can be in Bogota, where in all the joie de vivre and all the gayness and joy of the Colombian spirit, people say, what's a formula for fun in life? And I just say 10 Colombians, Mambe, a canoe, Northwest Amazon, and leave us alone. Colombia is like, if you hear a note of music, if it's a vallenato, perhaps you'll be able to escape. But if it's cumbia and the tail, the skirts of the women begin to spin with each tight turn of their feet, boy, you better make new plans for the day, because you're not leaving. It's just like such a joyous place. But that said, every family has suffered, and but beyond just the financial losses, the loss of land through extortion, the death and kidnapping, and you'll find that, like at a dinner, people will suddenly say, my uncle was held at that Paramo by the FARC, and someone will say, oh, my dad was held up there too, again, as if they found out they went to the same kind of colegio together, right? And this shows you how kind of impactful the 50 years of violence have been. But there's another aspect to that, which is a psychological impact on young people. And I think what the book tries to do is to say to Colombian people, in a sense, it's not all your fault, and the world is reducing you to caricature, and suggesting that, cocaine is sort of the story of Colombia, violence is the story of Colombia, and in a way, it's hard for a Colombian to rebut that, and sometimes, and sometimes it just takes an outsider to come in and say that's nonsense, or it takes an insider to come in and say, well, look, lift up your head from the sand and the misery and the complexity or the frustrations of daily life, and let's look at the big picture of who you are and how wonderful you are. I mean, sometimes that's, it's interesting how sometimes a writer from the outside can do that. And in my case, because I have such a knowledge of the landscape and the people of Colombia, but also remember that, I went down there for the first time when I was 14. My mother, when I was a kid, I don't know how she got this crazy idea of sending me to Colombia alone when I was 14, but she told me that Spanish was a language of the future, and she worked all her year as a modest secretary in a public school, to raise enough money to allow me to join a school teacher who was taking 6 Canadian boys to Cali. And I was the most fortunate of the 6 because I was the youngest of 14, but also whereas the others were billeted with quite wealthy families and spent much of the summer in the sweltering streets of Cali, I was outside of the city in the mountains at the edge of trails that went west to the Pacific. And for the 8 weeks or 10 weeks, whatever it was, I never saw any other Canadians. And it was a classic Colombian scene, an indulgent father, a grandmother who muttered to herself on a porch overlooking flowers and fruit trees, an angelic sister who more than once carried me and her brother home half drunk, to a mother kind beyond words who pretended to be angry as she stood by the garden gate, tapping her foot on the stone steps. Like for 8 or 10 weeks of a very young, impressionable life, I encountered the warmth and decency of a people that to my eye were charged by some mysterious and incredible intensity, and also a kind of frailty, an understanding of the frailty of the human condition. It was like nothing I had ever encountered in the more kind of staid and Protestant and Calvinist bourgeois world of Canada, if you will. And as it turned out, many of the other Canadian lads they succumbed to what Colombians call mamitis, and homesickness. And not only did I not get homesick, I honestly felt at the age of 14 that I had finally found home. And that it's funny because I think the best way I can express that is, years later, after Magdalena came out, I was in Bogota, and a journalist, asked the obvious question, why, what is it, what is this sort of strange obsession you have with Colombia, and this love affair you've had all your life with this nation, and I was just about to answer when Sandra pulled up her iPhone and read something I had totally forgotten I had written. But Sandra Uribe, who I haven't talked about in this moment, in this time with you, Jairo, was instrumental in the success of the book. She's a major character in the book. She introduced me to major characters, but she became my best friend in Colombia. And she also has a brilliant sense of the English language. She was a great researcher. If you read the acknowledgements of the book, I essentially say it's her book as much as it's my book, and we continue to work very closely together on projects. But we were in touch while I was doing the writing, and it's only because I did the actual writing and the conventions of publishing that my name alone is on the cover of the book, in a sense, right? But we're back and forth in the editing process, and sometimes on a daily basis and sometimes several times a day. And I remember apparently at the end of one frustrating day, I just sent her kind of a note to say, it's okay, we're gonna all start again tomorrow. And I'd totally forgotten what I had written. I just wrote it out in a couple of moments in an email, but somehow it touched her and she had kept it. And so when the journalist asked me why I had this thing about Colombia, before I could answer, she answered for me, reading this short passage off her iPhone. And this is apparently what I had written, something I'd utterly forgotten until that moment. And this is how it reads: I do long for the air of Bogota, that unmistakable scent that tells me I've landed on the savannah. It's hard to explain. When I talk about loving Colombia, it's something visceral, even sensual. To be away for too long is to be on life support. To step again onto the soil of the nation is to feel instantly that very sense of belonging that so long ago gave me the freedom to envision the man I've become. Whispered messages of a landscape unlike any other. The wild embrace of a people that allowed a vagabond boy to grow into a contented and realized scholar. It is the very madness of Colombia that rescued me. Like a sweet coefficient of the soul, my fire was so bright, so all-consuming, that I came very close to self-immolation. Only Colombia could match and give purpose to my passion. I was saved by that. And this is the key if anyone wants to understand my loyalty to the country.
Caribe Radio, nos proponemos ser la emisora online calificada para ser la mejor opción en comunicación para usted. Nos preparamos en noticias, deportes, cultura, música y de entretenimiento general para que usted esté conectado todo el tiempo con nosotros. Caribe Radio ofrece el mejor servicio de comunicación digital para que las empresas se hagan visibles a diferentes públicos. Desde lo público trabajamos para el servicio y por el servicio social. Caribe Radio Online nos entrenamos día a día para brindar la mejor opción en producción de medios digitales. Caribe Radio, la radio del futuro.